Thank you for joining me today. I know it's been a couple weeks since I last uploaded one of my discussion videos, but I thought that in the little time I have left playing at a church in the space where I can record, I would discuss this Sarabande. And this is one of my most dissonant pieces, I think, that I've ever written for the keyboard. And this is the fifth movement of my C major suite that I wrote at least a couple of years ago by now. And one thing that's unique about this Sarabande is that there's no distinct theme. Some of my other Sarabandes that I've written have an actual subject, but this one there's no real direct melody. It's all a conglomeration of just notes. I think that's the best way that you'd put it. In terms of harmony, it's both simple and not so simple at the same time. The main pieces that inspired this Sarabande are the C minor Sarabande from Bach's Second French Suite, that one, but also the G major Sarabande from the Fifth French Suite in G major, and I think between those two, this Sarabande is definitely the more contrapuntal. It's overbearingly difficult with 4 voices and 3 voices, and it's more difficult than it looks. So let's just take the opening phrase from bars 1 to 5. So we open with an unwritten mordent, because if you just play, it just sounds a little boring. So we just add a slight mordent from E to D, and then the appoggiatura of B to G. There's our half phrase. We cadence to G, but then with the introduction of the flat 7th, which is F natural, we fall back to C, but it's an inversion. But the top note never changes. All the motion is in the bass. A minor. Kind of an E7. But instead of falling right to A, instead we have a deceptive chord, an F major, which is the 6th in A, but the 4th in C major. Whoops, sorry. There's the end of our first phrase in C major. And so it's this interesting kind of melody that we have. Then almost like an afterthought, so it's really almost as if there's never a complete statement. It's as if our actual statement is only 5 measures long, and then we have this where it's really just closing in on the modulation to G. And the other thing about this entire suite as a whole is that the majority of it is dedicated to this C major scale. We hear our scales everywhere throughout this entire suite, and maybe later on I'll get to discussing movements from the suite as a whole. But this keyboard suite, it features scale movements because up until studying with my first harpsichord instructor, I had never mastered my scales, and it's been a couple of years, so I still kind of haven't. But this entire suite is a dedication to working on those scales. So we hear it at the end of bar 6 G major, even though it changes voices. So that's the first subject, the first section, the A section, if you will. And the second section is a little bit longer. This is very typical of a sarabande from the era. So let me just play the first phrase from bars 8 to the beginning of 12. Sorry. I guess you could say that's really the first phrase. Cadence to E minor. And I think in terms of expression, this is definitely a bittersweet sarabande. It's definitely not necessarily full of melancholy, but definitely, I think, peaceful reflection, if you will. I mean, I was finishing my lessons with my first harpsichord instructor, and actually this entire suite is dedicated to him, because if I hadn't, the lessons that I learned from him were incredibly beneficial, and I wanted to reflect everything that I had learned from him and put it all into an entire suite. And I'll link a performance of the entire suite down below. But this piece is kind of an homage to the lessons that we had together. And Bach did the same thing. Composers would all, well, sometimes composers would dedicate pieces to their teachers. This is evident in some of Bach's organ works, that the influence of some of his teachers is evident in his music. One of the great, I think, the Toccata and Fugue in E major is directly dedicated to Dietrich Buxtehude. So, let's see. So we cadence to E minor, which isn't necessarily unusual, but it's a very interesting road to get there. We start in G. There's an interesting harmonic point, because in the beginning it's just 5, but in this it's 2, because we're in G major, so A minor is 2 of G. So fifth in the bass. Passing E minor to C. There's our 4. There's a 5/7 chord. G major. thinking that we're going to E minor, but instead we have an A minor chord. Back to the 2, which is really the 4 of E minor. We've got our 5, well, technically 7. D sharp is the 7th of E in E minor. There we are, with a 5 in the bass. And finally in bar 12 we cadence to E minor, but this leads directly into, I think, one of the most difficult sequences I've ever written, because there's a lot going on. I think that the dissonances would be brought out further with, say, a group of viols, a group of maybe viols or viola da gamba. So let's just hear that sequence from bar 12 to bar 16. So here we are in E minor. So we move from E minor to D major, and the road to get there isn't easy. I think I just said that, sorry. So let's just hear the sequence and take it beat by beat. So we've got 1, there's E minor on beat 2, A minor for the first part of beat 3, then we have C major, a kind of D7, what quality is that? It's blank, I don't know. And then we have, this is really a D7 chord. A7, which is really the 5 of D, and D is the 5 of G, G is the 5 of C, so it's a very intense circle of fifths in bar 15. And then our 7, and we're going to lead right back into G major. Falling 7 in the bass, F natural. Cadence to C with the C major scale to close everything out, but it's shifted in between voices. Tenor and then bass. And like I said, this whole suite is essentially dedicated to the concept of the C major scale, and but this entire piece is where I think counterpoint and expression really combine, and that's something that I like to do in my music. I think it has to feature elements of counterpoint and also expression, because in my mind at least you can't have one without the other. and these final bars from 18 to 20, everything is very condensed and kind of muddied, I guess, and maybe I'll make a discussion video of the first movement, the prelude, but the final bars of the Sarabande are definitely kind of taken from the last few bars in the prelude. So this is definitely a very harmonically and technically difficult piece of music, and it sounds, you know, pretty when I play it right, that is, but it does have its difficulties. So I guess that's really all I have to say about this piece. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next week.